Hello and welcome to another edition of Open Door Live. I'm Vince Robinson and I have a very special guest today. He is Pemon Rami. He's an international film producer, theater director, arts administrator, historian, lecturer, and consultant who wields one of the most impressive film pedigrees in Chicago, Illinois, and beyond. The features and TV programs that have relied on Rami's casting direction expertise include Blues Brothers, Mahogany, Cooley High, The Spook Who Sat by the Door, Welcome to Success, which is the Marva Collins Story, and One in a Million. He began his career in 1968 as Associate Director of the South Side Center for the Performing Arts. In 1971, he became the director of the Kuumba Workshop, and from 1973 to 1979, he was artistic managing director of the Lamont Zeno Theater. In 1987, he co-founded Mixed Media Productions, a company that produced independent theatrical, video, multi-image, and film projects. Along the way, he served as managing artistic director for the Phoenix Black Theater Troupe and general manager for Marla Gibbs Crossroads National Education and Entertainment Complex in Los Angeles. There's so much more that he has accomplished in his lifetime, and we're going to touch on some of those accomplishments, and we're also going to talk about a new book that he has written, his memoirs. I have been given that book by a very good friend of mine, Mr. Stephen E. Boyd, who made the trip all the way to Chicago from Cleveland to attend the book signing that you did. Regretfully I couldn't make it that day, but I'm just so excited, and I have to tell you that I'm pleased and honored that you would grant me this time to have this conversation with you. So thanks for agreeing to do this, and thanks for appearing on Open Door.
Well, thank you for having me, Vince. It's programs like yours that are reaching people that we have to continue. We have to have a source of connecting, a voice of truth and honesty and communication. And so I try to do as many of shows like this as humanly possible, not only to advertise, my book and what I do, but also to give credence to the fact that that the institutions that control media and communication are extremely important, and we need to support them as much as we can.
Yes. So the name of your book is When Blackness Was Golden, Observations from the Front Line. I know you were intentional about the subtitle for that book, and I want to talk about that book in depth because I know there's so much there to gain. But before we go there, I just want to get from you what it was like growing up in Chicago. I'm assuming that you grew up in Chicago. And if so, making that leap from what you were doing as a young person into this realm of theater and film and art and the connection that you have also with your wife.
Yes, I grew up in Chicago. I was born in Providence Hospital, which is the first and oldest African American controlled and owned hospital in America. I was born there. I grew up in what was considered Bronzeville, in the Black community, and ultimately I lived in Stateway Gardens. In the 1950s, um, the Chicago was an area where, because we were segregated, we had to be responsible to each other. But in there came a beauty, came a wonderful community where we knew each other, where all the resources that we needed were right there because we weren't allowed to go other places. And so when I grew up in Stateway Gardens, when it was initially built, the park district there had acting classes, it had dance classes, all of us were free. We had all types of arts and crafts. I can just go on about the types of programs that were being offered there. And as young people, we had an opportunity to be exposed to it. And at the same time, it gave us the right to determine whether we really had interest in it. We did a project for the Department of Education at one point. It was called Follow Your Dream. And the hook for that song was, first you have to see it and then you can be it. And that's the reality. There have to be things in your life that prompt you to say, that's something that I want to do. And that's what happened to me when I was playing Little League Baseball, and I went back to the Park District to take the equipment back. There was a theater company there run by a gentleman named Okoro Harold Johnson, who went on to found the ETA Theater, which is celebrating their 50th year. in Chicago, and they were doing theater. They were doing the work of Langston Hughes, and I stood there fascinated. He asked me, did I want to be involved? And that was the beginning of my introduction to the business. And after that, I was introduced to Theodore Ward, one of the founders of the Negro Federal Theater, and Langston Hughes and Richard Wright. And Ted took me under his wing as a 17-year-old. I think I was 17 at that time. I might have been 16, and gave me the opportunity to direct my first professional play. Took me under his wing, and I was with him every day for almost 2 years, learning under a master. And so that was the beginning of it. And Chicago at that point, as many issues as we had in terms of the tenements where we were confined to, the police brutality that was going on then that still exists and goes on today. But in spite of that, we had a community that was helpful, that was strong. There was a lady that lived on the first floor in the building that we lived in, 3651 South Federal. Her name was Miss Wright. I am certain that she had to be the first neighborhood watch. This lady sat outside. She had 13 kids, but she would sit outside. She knew every child. She knew who we belonged to, and she would tell every time we did something wrong. So she kept us in line, and that's how that community was. There were men there that were around and supportive. My father was the coach of a baseball team, and so all of the young men had a high deal of respect for my father, and he had the love enough to be there every day with these young people and to try to teach him what he had learned as part of the Negro Leagues when he was growing up.
Mm-hmm. I know that the experience that you had was very instrumental in shaping and forming your approach. I read somewhere where you saw this study that was done about rats that were kept in a very small space.
Yes, it was written by John Calhoun, who was a Norwegian scientist that did an experiment with rats on how you take rats, put them in a confined area, but give them access to unlimited growth. So they had all the food they needed, they had all the water that they needed. What ultimately ended up happening in that environment is that they ultimately became cannibals in a way. They began to feed on each other. They began to demonstrate different sexual preferences. They began to eat their children. All of these things happened. He referred to it as a behavior sink. And it's exactly what happened in the housing projects. I found that copy of that report while I was working for the Chicago Public Housing Authority. And this was back in the early 70s. And when I read it, I was fascinated by the fact that the study had done, and I saw examples of what happened in this study demonstrated in the community in which I was growing up. And so people knew that if you took 1,000 families and you put them in this small space, that these things would ultimately happen. And so and people can look him up. His name is John Calhoun, and it's the rat experiment.
I'm curious from your perspective now, in light of the fact that you had that experience and we're fast forwarding 40, 50 years, do you see any changes in that dynamic, or do you see a perpetuation of those conditions and the resulting impact on our community?
It actually got worse. It got worse because part of the condition of living there was that you had to have a certain income, which at a point forced all the men out. And when it forced the men out of the housing area, that's when the proliferation of gangs took place and they began to take over. Where the men would stand up and kept it from happening, it began to happen. Another thing of interest that happened that I talk about in the book was Stateway Gardens, where I grew up, was from 35th Street to 39th. And we all went to the same grammar school, which was called Crispus Attucks. Some point along the way, they decided that they were going to split the housing projects in half. 35th Street to 37th would go to one school. 37th to 39th would go to another school. What ended up happening was the same thing that happened in Vietnam and North Vietnam and South Vietnam, or in India and Pakistan. These folks that were cousins, that were family members, that had grown up together became enemies based on distance and based on the association with the institutions that they ultimately ended up going to. And so we ended up in a community that had the Blackstone Rangers on one end and the gangster disciples on one end, on the other end. And so I know, do I think it got better? No, I think it got worse. It got worse because the resources were stolen, the money that was set aside for the Public Housing Authority to keep it up, to make sure that the elevators worked, to make sure that there were light bulbs and that the grass was taken care of. That money was stolen, especially here in Chicago. And so it began to go down further and further and further because of the neglect. The other part of it was that it was the community in which we had a strong power base in terms of politics, because there were so many people, so many black folks between 22nd Street and 57th Street, that it was a voting block. And so ultimately the city said, well, we got to break that voting block up. So they tore the housing projects down. They sent all of these people, some of which were enemies for a long period of time, into the same community. So where they might have been on 24th at one point and on 35th at one point, they ended up sometimes in the same buildings, sometimes on the same block. And I think that the violence that is demonstrated in Chicago has something to do with that move.
As you were talking about the way the black family basically got disintegrated by forcing the black man out of the household, I was thinking of that film Claudine,
Mm-hmm.
James Earl Jones and Diane Carroll, and I'm thinking about the power in that narrative, because now we can look back at that film and we can get a certain sense of history, even though it was a fictional account of something that happened. We get a snapshot of what that was like, and I know that you relate to what you do as storytelling versus filmmaking. So if you could you just talk about the power of the narrative and the importance of us telling the story the way only we can tell it?
Well, so speaking of Claudine, it is a prime example of what I just talked about. Uh, there were times when the James Earl Jones character had to hide in the closet when the social worker showed up, and that was the same thing that happened in Stateway Gardens. The men had to hide, or they had to leave for a couple of days when they knew that the social worker would be coming by, because if they were caught there, they would cut the resources and so forth. I refer to myself as a storyteller for two reasons. One, I want to tell a little short story that I heard um, H. Rap Brown say some years ago, and it's a folk tale called Father to Son, and the son is talking to his father, and he says, "Daddy, you tell me that the lion is the king of the jungle, yet in every book I read, the man always kills the lion. So, Daddy, why is that so?" So the father looks at his son and says, "Until the lion learns to write, the story will always end the same." Our stories have to be told by us. They have to be told by us, they have to be written by us, and they need to be created by us, because we are the ones that are responsible for leaving things that will encourage our young people to move forward in a way that is positive. When people talk about violence in America, the only way that you perpetuate violence is if you don't have a value for life. A value for life comes about as a result of your being able to look at the future and know that you can see yourself in it, that there is a possibility that I can move forward and I can be successful. But when you have people eradicating everything that looks like it could be good for your economic growth, your political growth, or your personal growth, then you are stymied. You're left with, well, what do I do now? For example, we tried to deal with the nonprofit, not nonprofit, but nonviolent approach. What happened? King gets killed. We had Malcolm, who was more vigilant about fighting for our cause, and saying that you should, not turn the other cheek, but if somebody slaps you, you don't slap him back. And he was murdered. Um, We can go down the line. We had a policy, the policy movement in Chicago, which was a game with 3 balls, was started by a guy named Policy Sam in Chicago. It was made illegal. A lot of the guys that were policy makers or policy kings were put in jail or run off. And then it was made legal again and called the lottery. So the lottery was originally an economic tool for the Black community. And then it was taken away. Look at Negro League Baseball. Negro League Baseball was an economic engine for the Black community. Wherever the Negro League teams played, we made the bats. We had restaurants around. We made the uniforms. It was a way in which we and our community could generate money. What happened? One man gets a job, Jackie Robinson. He gets a job with the majors, and we lose an industry. And so integration meant take the best of yours and put it over here with ours and let your businesses go. And it never should have went that way. So as storytellers, we have an obligation to create things that will uplift the community and also to provide a vehicle for telling our history in the way that we think it ought to be told, which is one of the reasons why I wanted to make sure that I wrote the book, because I was young enough early to have worked with people like Cab Calloway, Theodore Ward, to people like Chance the Rapper and No Name. All these folks across this wide bridge of ages we've been able to work with because of our own commitment to give back to the community. And so we have to tell the story of what manhood is supposed to be. We have to tell the story of what it means to build a family. We have to tell the good and the bad that will allow us to uplift ourselves. But if you don't look at yourself as a storyteller and a keeper of culture, a provider of cultural information that you give back to your community, then who are you doing your work for?
Yes. We were speaking earlier before this interview started, and I mentioned to you a colleague of mine, Peter Lawson Jones, who wrote a play that dealt with the Phoenix Society. And it's an agency locally that helps people who are in recovery from mental health issues and addiction. And I watched the play, and there was a scene in the play where the protagonist was someone who was suffering from PTSD. He was a veteran of the war in Afghanistan, and he was doing all the right things, and he was making great progress in his life and his sobriety. And then he sat down in front of a television and saw war footage, and it was a trigger for him. And, you know, upon being triggered, he reached into his pocket, he pulls out his phone, and he calls the drug dealer. But between the time that he got to the drug dealer and the time that he left the house, he called his sponsor, and his sponsor talked him off the ledge, and he was able to retain his sobriety and continue the progress in his life. The reason that I bring that up is because this was a situation where we had the opportunity to control the narrative. And instead of making it one in which we end up being a victim and going into this deep, dark place, we see a triumph. And the thing that's so important to me right now is the fact that we need to start telling stories in this way so that we can cease being victims. You know, we talk about 1619. We talk about the fact that we've had this slavery experience in this country and all of the negative things that have happened to us as a result of that. And we keep perpetuating this mindset of victimhood. But then you have a story like Black Panther, and all of a sudden you see a paradigm shift in consciousness. And you see people all of a sudden now that they're proud to have an association with Africa. They have African in them. They're wearing dashikis now, when it may have been fashionable back in the 70s, but in the 2000s, perhaps not. But we've had this resulting rise in consciousness. And I just wanted you to talk about the importance of having control of that narrative and using that narrative as a means of empowerment.
If you look at a lot of the films that have been produced, over the years. Let's just take Sylvester Stallone's work, whether it's Rocky or whether it's Rambo. In his projects, he always wins. You have what's called a lost point in films where the person that's the lead or the star gets to a situation where everything is lost. They might be right out at the edge of a cliff, and then they come back from that. Well, when you look at a lot of the movies that are made, they win. And so when we're talking about like the issue with us not wanting to do films that have slave narratives, I think what's really happening there is that we want to win. It's not about whether or not you tell something from an era, because that era existed and we need to deal with it. But if you can tell that story through the eyes of winners, through the eyes of people that have overcome, through the eyes of people that champion a way out, then it's a different kind of story than to just show somebody getting beat and and suffering year after year after year. But that's part of what we should be obligated to do. Back to the mental health piece that you mentioned, there are a lot of us that suffer with not only mental illness, but with not being able to find that anybody has an answer to the issues that we have, or we're not put in a situation where we can value um, the work that other people are doing. So I did a project around mental health, and when we had the session, we were dealing with being bipolar. What we found was that the majority of people didn't even know the services that were available to them. Why does that happen? Because the media, there's no place in the media where these folks can go to find the real services that they need that would help them. There was a time when black radio was that you would tune into black radio, and the DJs were well known. They were out in the community. They were supporting our efforts, and there was talk radio that would discuss the issues that relate to us. And a lot of that is virtual now, so you still have more opportunity to get to it, but less opportunity to know that it exists.
Well, we've also seen syndication in radio kind of take over. I mean,
Terrible.
yeah, I mean, there was a time when you had DJs and they were DJs, but they were activists. And then on Sunday morning, you would have community affairs programming and you could have some real conversations. But now you got one or two or three or four comedians, and, they got the afternoon and the morning on lock, and then the local presence is gone. And it's also not good for local artists because
Right.
it's just so difficult, and the local artists are the ones that are creating and producing music that has some kind of substance, some kind of message to it, but they can't get their message out through the airwaves, so they have to depend on perhaps smaller audiences. So we've seen a lot of changes. I wanted to just go back to what we were talking about earlier, because I'm just remembering this time in the 70s when we were making films. Melvin Van Peebles kind of got us started. And then you had Gordon Parks and others who created films in which we did win.
Mm-hmm.
Shaft won,
Mm-hmm.
Superfly won, Dolomite won. The film that Eddie Murphy did just a few years back on the story of Dolomite, Rudy Ray Moore, was powerful.
Mm-hmm.
What do you think happened that we were in this place where all of a sudden we were creating heroes, and then we kind of slipped back into being the criminals again?
There's a period which is known as the Blaxploitation period. But the problem with the term is that it becomes something that is used to blame black people rather than the studios that it should be blaming. I would never refer to the Spook Who Sat by the Door, the Learning Tree, Shaft as Blaxploitation films. The reason that I wouldn't is because they were produced and written by black people for black people, and some of and they got paid accordingly. But there's a whole series of films that were made so that the studios could get onto making some of the money that was being generated by this new black media. And as a result, the independent black filmmakers started to not exist because the major studios started to usurp their work and then to take over the amount of films that were being produced. Same thing happened in theater. You know, we went from in Chicago specifically, we went from 22 theaters that were specifically black theaters between 1968 and 1980 down to three, only two with institutions with buildings, and that's because the funders turned around and said, "Well, we want to make sure that we are dealing with diversity in our audiences." And so, what did they do? They gave the white theaters money to produce one black film a year, or one black play a year. And as a result, the black companies couldn't get any money. They ended up going out of business, and we still are now left with that one show for the most part that these white theaters are producing.
Yeah, that's amazing. You spoke of the film, The Spook Who Sat by the Door, and I know that it was a pivotal aspect of your evolution in terms of film. Could you talk about the importance of that film?
Yes. Okay. So Sam Greenlee wrote the film. The book is currently being re-released. The third edition of it. Sam's daughter Natiki has done a new version of it. It's out, so people can order it on Amazon, I believe, and they should read the book. The book is about the first black CIA agent, and all they would let him do was sit by the door, which is why it was termed and called The Spook Who Sat by the Door. When the studios were approached about distribution, they took it on because they thought that it was about a ghost. They didn't see the film, and so Sam was able to get it released. And then when they saw it, they said, "Oh no, 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 no! We got to get rid of this." And the FBI moved in and got rid of it. So it's about a CIA agent that is trained, becomes trained by the CIA, and then decides he's going to quit. He comes back to Chicago and organizes street gangs into a revolutionary army for the purpose of securing the community and uplifting it. And so it was a powerful message, which is why it was hidden for so many years. And then Tim Reed and Daphne Maxwell Reed got together. They found a copy of it, and then they remastered it. They redid the color, redid the sound, and so there's a better version of it out there. In terms of my own personal story, Sam Greenlee called me one day. I was the theater director at the time and partial actor, and he called me and said, "Look, I wrote this book. We've written a movie, and I wrote a part specifically that I want you to do," which was Shorty Duncan, the drug dealer that gets killed, and that's what starts the revolution. And so I went out. I shot some of the scenes here in Chicago. We shot in Gary, Indiana, and then I shot in L.A. When I came back from L.A., I was asked to be an extra on the film, and I said to the casting person, I said, "But I just did a starring role. I'm not going to do an extra." He said, "Well, it's in a movie with Isaac Hayes." So I said, "Okay, fine. I'll come out." So I go out and I'm an extra standing on the corner. Isaac is walking back and forth past me. He stops and he asks me, "Does he know me?" And I said, "Well, no," but we started talking. We were both Leos, born in August, and he had seen an advanced copy of Spook Who Sat by the Door. So we became pretty close during that period. And when the production company left, a few months later, I got a call from American International Pictures about doing Cooley High, and from Motown about doing Mahogany, and both of which I had been recommended by Isaac Hayes. And so Sam Greenlee, in doing Spook, led me to Isaac Hayes, which led me to Mahogany, and then 14 other feature films after that.
Well, I think I saw the rougher version of The Spook Who Sat by the Door. Perhaps I was able to view it on YouTube a few years ago after having heard about it for all those years. And I was just blown away, you know, because the brother had it together.
He did.
he, he had it together. He got the job done. They came out on top. But for folks to see that type of imagery right now might not be in the best interests of the FBI and the CIA, especially if it gives us any idea about taking matters into our own hands.
And that's what they felt in the 60s, which is why it was hidden. It was labeled as a different film, and it was just hidden away. And the FBI purposely told the theaters that they couldn't run it, so it ended up being shut down. But we have all types of films that are produced. So just take, for example, any of the movies that about the White House that Morgan Freeman has done lately, fallen down or taken over and blown up, whatever those cases are. You can do movies about terrorists. You could do movies about the White House and the capture of the president. You could do all of that. But when it comes down to a film that is about the freedom of Black people, and even in the Spook Who Sat by the Door, he makes a comment that it's not that the movie is not, or that the action is not about hating whitey. It's about loving Black people enough to do anything for them to be free. There's some misunderstandings that I think that have been generated by people in the media. For example, we are constantly told that Black people died for the right to vote. And I am so opposed to that idea. I don't think that Black people died for the right to vote. I think that they died for freedom, and the right to vote was a tool along the path towards freedom. But if you say that Black people died for the right to vote, then that's all you do is vote. And if you're only voting, then you're not moving politicians in the direction that they're going to help your community in the way that they should. Politicians their real role is the distribution of resources and the coordination of resources. And if they are not coordinating or distributing the resources to your community the way that they should be, then we shouldn't be supporting them. On the other hand, if you vote for somebody, you got to hold them accountable to make sure that they do what they say they're going to do. And that does not mean going to the polls once every 4 years to make the difference. It means calling, it means pestering, it means making sure that the political force that is supposed to be supporting our community is made to do just that.
Yeah, and as you put it in those terms, it only places a burden of us of going to the polls every 2 years or 4 years or whatever.
Right.
But I was just thinking as you were making those comments, our solutions don't come from politicians. Our solutions come from creative people. And artists are creative people.
Yeah.
We're having conversation now about racism as a public health crisis. And if that's the case, and if you look at the impact that artists have on communities, where do folks go to get their healing?
And that's a legitimate question.
Yeah. I mean, do we go to the hospital? We go to the hospital when something hurts. And unless you're staying at the hospital for an extended period of time, you're going there to address your pain. But on a day-to-day basis, where do we go for healing? We put on that music that touches our soul. We might, just get lost in a painting that speaks to us in some kind of way. We might put on some music and dance. I mean, our healing is directly tied to our culture. So when we look at essential workers, for instance, over the past 2 years, everybody was thinking about police officers and nurses and doctors being essential workers. But there's a musician who just transitioned here in Cleveland. His name is Eddie Backus Sr. He had a stint there with Rahsaan Roland Kirk. They were partners. And one of the stories that's told about Mr. Backus is that he would set up, he and his band would play a certain place downtown, and people who had been working at the steel mills would come to hear him play. They put in a long, hard day's work. And before they went home to face wife and children, they went through this decompression that happened when they connected with this man who was giving them their music. And music has been one of the things that has been our salvation. You can go to church and you can listen to a pastor say all those things that he says, and some of them might go in one ear and out the other. But when the choir sings, there's something about that reaches you right here, you know. So, you know, it's just the importance of the arts. What are your feelings about that?
Every society, except for this one, um, has always understood that for you to be healthy, that your mind, your body, and your spirit all had to be healthy at the same time. And in America, we separated the sciences. So you go to somebody for your head, you go to the minister for the soul, but it actually there's a connection there. And the people that are creating, we have every opportunity to change the minds of people, to encourage them to act a certain way. And, you know, a lot of people will say, I'm just doing me. That is so far from real that it's unimaginable. None of us are doing me. Most of us are encouraged by what we see in the media, by the commercials that we hear, by what we see when we walk in a store and the signs that they have that are up. We are not freely operating in this world. And so I think that the musicians have an important part to play. The reason that I called the book "When Blackness is Golden" is because I really think that it was an era between 1960s and the 1980s where it was more about the community than the individual. And as such, you had major singers and performers singing "I'm Black and I'm Proud." You had Marvin Gaye. You had the staple singers. You had James Brown. You had all these people, but what they were singing about was things to uplift us. We had in Chicago, we had the African American Patrolmen's League that was created for the purpose of helping to protect the police, but also to help to protect the community. We had the Organization of Black Psychologists. We had the Organization of Black Doctors. You can just go on and on and on down the line, and every one of them set out to improve the quality of life of Black people. The other thing that happened during this period is that we had a lot of people that would either go to the university to be trained, or they would go to the Art Institute, or they would go wherever they would go if they had the money to be trained. In Chicago, and I use that as a specific example of the Southside Center for the Performing Arts, a lot of those artists would go down to the Art Institute, and when they finished at the Art Institute, they would come back to the Southside Community Arts Center and they would teach for free what they had learned there. There was a commitment to uplifting the folks that were behind us. And I think what has happened in terms of that going away was a number of things. I think integration had a great deal to do with our loss of the ability to create institutions and communities that were ours. You know, a lot of times when we talk about riots, for example, I have said on a number of occasions that I don't think that Black people have ever burnt down their community in the history of riots in this country. I can't come up with one time that we have done that. Now, we have burnt communities where we resided. We burnt down communities where we've been contained. But if you think about the Black communities that where we own stuff, we didn't go burn that stuff down. You know, so I think that a great deal of our responsibility has been to create a method of young people realizing that art and the role of art is to make the earth a better place. And we need to do it in color. You know, like, for example, like if Africa had never been disrupted by slavery, what would it look like? What would the world look like? We know that it wouldn't be gray, it wouldn't be brown, it wouldn't be square, you know, because that is not the nature of Black people. You know, so we still have to get back to what is truly us. I went to see a production of Gospel from Colonus. Morgan Freeman was in it, the Five Blind Boys. It was a heck of a production. I saw it on Broadway in New York. And I saw it with a white audience, and they loved it. And they sat there and they were kind. And at the end, they gave us a standing ovation. It was great. I go back and I see what the black audience. The black audience was in the aisles. They were in the aisles. They was up on the stairs. They was hooting and hollering and singing along with them. We have a different kind of energy. We have a different type of aesthetic that is associated with us. And as a result, it doesn't mean that other people can't participate in what we do. I mean, we go to see love stories, that ain't no black folks in. We've seen space epics that we have very, very poor representation in. Yet we support them because we can see and get into the essence of the story and not be overcome by the ethnicity of the person that's playing the role. I can't say the same thing for other groups. I think they have the tendency to assume that if a black person is doing it, it has no interest for them.
Well, I, like you, can remember a time when we weren't seeing ourselves at all. I mean, remember when Diane Carroll's show came out?
Right.
Exactly. It was just unprecedented. So it was like Ed Sullivan's show would come on, and there would be a black act on Ed Sullivan. So, hey, everybody's around the TV set because, hey, there's black people on,
Mm-hmm.
So,
but some of that had to do with the medium itself. So it was a new toy, and so you got a new toy in front of you, and whenever you expose it to black people, then they want to see black people that are on it because we were excluded from it. However, most of those people that were on those shows, we knew who they were. How did that come about? So if somebody said Nat King Cole was on TV, black folks knew who Nat King Cole was because he was in the community. He was at the Regal. He was at the Savoy. He was at the DeLisa in Chicago. He was so we had a community that evolved around these celebrities because they were part of us. And then it became that they were separated from us. And even today, a lot, because they don't live in the community, there's no connection a lot of times. I mean, you see people like Master P, who ended up investing in his community where he came from. I think that Queen Latifah has just done something similar, and Whitney Houston had done something around that as well. So we do have to still have people to go back and say, no, we're not giving up these communities. We're going to reinvest in them, and we're going to still make them relevant to us.
Yes. I didn't want this to get past us, but I did read about your relationship with Oscar Brown. Yeah. And we had some of his family on a couple of years ago on the radio show that I do on the AM station here in Cleveland. It's a news talk station. But the subject of that interview was the fact that basically his estate has been taken over by the attorneys, and the family's not having a whole lot of control or influence about that. It's a totally separate subject, but I was wondering if you knew anything about that. But more importantly, I just wanted to talk to you about your relationship with Oscar Brown and what that did for your career.
Oscar was a dear friend. So first of all say that the his estate has gotten back into his family hands.
Great.
His daughter Africa and Maggie and his son Napoleon are controlling it now. So it's finally gotten back there. But my comment about this is something that I think needs to be addressed and needs to be addressed constantly. A lot of us don't write wills. We don't leave information as to what we want done. Oscar had 3 wives, multiple children. And so he didn't leave any instructions. So then you've got the 3 sides of the family that are, trying to figure out, who's going to do what and who's going to take charge. And so what I would say to most people, irrespective of how much you think you have, you might think, well, I don't have a lot. Even if you only have a ring that you bought, for $20, and you want to make sure that goes to someone, you should be clear about it and intentional. And so the message, I think, when you look at Oscar Brown, when you look at Sam Greenlee, when you look at a lot of our entertainers, they didn't and have not taken the time to write their wills. Now, that having been said, I went to New York. I had done a play, and I went to New York. I was 19 at the time, and I decided I would just go see some theater and just kind of hang out in New York, and because I had gone to visit my sister in Philadelphia. So I take the bus to New York. I get off. I look up, and I'm at Grand Central Station. I'm saying, "Wow, this is New York. This is wonderful." And I look down, and I see Oscar Brown and Muhammad Ali walking down the street. They were doing Big Time Buck White on Broadway, and it was when Muhammad had been kicked out of boxing. Oscar had written this musical, and Muhammad Ali was the lead. He played Big Time Buck White. So I had a chance to spend almost 2 weeks with them on Broadway. And then after that, Oscar and I became really close, and almost every place that I would go, he would be there. And then I went down to Phoenix and I produced a show, and he let me use his material for that. I was the second director that he selected. Well, I was the only director after himself that he selected to direct his play, A Slave Story, which I did in Chicago ages ago. And he was an incredible person. There were two things that I got from Oscar. The first was when I was in high school, I saw a show called Lyrics of Sunshine and Shadows. It was the work of Paul Laurence Dunbar put to music. So Oscar wrote the script. Okoro Harold Johnson directed, and Keelan Karan, who in many ways was the precursor to Earth, Wind, and Fire in terms of training and pulling those musicians together, he did the music. And I was a sophomore, and I saw the show, and I said, that's what I want to do. I want, not only do I want to be in theater, but I want to specifically do that, creating those kind of musicals with poetry and so forth. And if I had seen a bad play that day, I would have become a furniture refinisher, because that's what my father did. And I would have been working in the wood shop somewhere. But I saw a good play, and it motivated me to want to try to do that. And Oscar was one of those people that took me under his wing, and I directed something in LA with him, and something in Phoenix, and something in Chicago, and he became a really, really very good friend.
Okay. Well, theater is such a powerful tool. Earlier in our conversation, you talked about hearing something that in order to be it, you have to see it,
Mm-hmm.
which is really the whole idea of what manifestation is. And it's really something that you do in your meditation. You envision it, and then you use the energy or the power that comes from your will to see it into fruition.
Mm-hmm.
So you go ahead.
No, I'm just saying that's legitimate, and I think that a lot of times, the older you get, the more you get that message. Younger people respond to what they feel, and so we just have to keep putting things in front of them. For example, if you have a child or a teenager that decides that they want to be in medicine, that they want to be a doctor or they want to be a nurse, I would strongly recommend that they volunteer in a hospital, because you don't know whether you can deal with that until you're in it. You don't, like, for example, can you deal with the smell of blood? Can you deal with the sight of blood? And so a lot of times you have to be working in certain environments. Oscar, to go to back to him for a second, Oscar created a concept called the Dome, Dome, the Dome, which is a dramatic organization of musical expression. His thought was that you could take music and characters and create a story without a script. And he did it on a number of occasions with a number of different pieces that he worked at. And so when I saw his domes, I began to create them, because I felt that there was a really good way of telling stories and to integrate what was us. We are different kind of people, and so we're not the kind of folks that sit back and don't participate. Um, in African society, culturally, it came down to rituals and reenactments. The rituals were, oh, you know what? I just want to go back for a second to something that you said earlier. I was part of a panel with a series of rabbis that were from all over the world. And we did it in LA. And the name of it was, I think, Why Me, Why Now? And so this African rabbi said that his father had gotten cancer, and he took his father to an oncologist, and he took his father to the witch doctor. And so these other rabbis who were from all around the world, they said, well, why would you take him to the witch doctor? You know, you're a learned man, you are a rabbi, blah, blah. He said, well, I took him to the doctor to treat what he had. I took him to the witch doctor for why he got it in the first place.
Mm.
And I found that to be so profound because it goes back to us culturally and what is relevant to us in terms of our DNA. You just can't assume that because you're Black that we can take the same kind of medicine. There's this concept of lumpers and splitters. You know, a lumper would be, everybody's Black, so you treat them the same way. A splitter would be like what they do with when you are given blood. You know, you say your blood type is O or your blood type is A, and you get that same kind of blood. That means you've been split into categories. Well, Black people are different. Even among ourselves, when we do a comparison among ourselves, we are totally different. As a matter of fact, it's been proven in certain studies that we are more like white people than we are like each other, which is really even more profound. But I wanted to go back to that notion because why are we in the position that we're in? It's because we don't eat what we were born to eat, what we were, what is indigenous to us. We don't think the way that we should. A lot of us suffer from the ability to be able to tell truth. We tell our children to lie constantly. We tell them not to stand up. We tell them not to be men. We tell them to look down. When police confront you, give up everything. We tell them that what they dress is relevant, and it's truly not. I told a story not so long ago about two guys standing on the corner. I said, two guys standing on the corner. One has sagging pants. The other has on a suit. Police drive up. Who do they take? And I said, the person with the sagging pants. Half hour later, police drive up. Brother standing on the corner with a suit. Who do they take? The person in the suit. We have to stop looking at the flashy lights and get down to the specificity of what will help us to be free. And freedom implies that you have the ability to control your health. You have the ability to create an economic system that will allow you to not only contribute, but to take care of your family. You have to be in a position where you can provide security. There's some things that as a community that we have had over the years that we no longer have, that we should be trying to get back to.
Well, speaking of health, and you mentioned the example with the rabbis and talking about, going to the doctor or the witch doctor. I think it's important to point out that there are some doctors who go to witch doctors.
Most certainly. most certainly, yeah. And that will take, alternative medicine, but won't talk about it to their own patients. Because there are a lot of people that years ago, I didn't take the flu shot. And the reason that I didn't take the flu shot is because none of the doctors that I was going to would take it. So, because I would always ask them, well, did you take your flu shot? I would say, no, I don't take that. Mm-hmm. Well, why would I take it? So a lot of times it is the economics of it that keeps even the doctors from giving us the reality of what we need to face. And if a person can tell you, well, all you have to do is eat some bananas, or they can say, well, you got to have this operation. A lot of times they're going to push you towards the operation because it's more money, or they'll push you towards the medicine rather than the natural source of healing. And so you're absolutely right. They do have that tendency.
Yes. Just before we wrap up, I just wanted to talk to you about some of the folks that you've been able to work with over the years. I mean, it's an impressive list, and there are just too many names for me to mention. But I know that this idea of intergenerationality, if I can create a word, is there, and you've been able to work with folks like Chance the Rapper, as well as people like Robert Townsend, and you mentioned Tim Reed, all of whom have done magnificent things in their respective areas. Chance is one who came up as that independent artist, and he made it fashionable to be an independent artist. I'm just wondering if perhaps you may have influenced him in any way towards that mindset.
We had a program called the Teen Talk Radio Theater, which was designed to create radio dramas that evoke discussions about moral dilemmas. It was an environment where young people could come in and learn the art of conversation, conflict resolution. They would write their radio plays, they would write commercials, they would write the music. But more importantly, they were able to realize that they had the capacity to tell their stories and to control their truth. And Chance was one of the people that was in that program. I think what he benefited from being in the program is realizing that he had some say with what his life would ultimately become. He did a song called "Not Good Enough" when he was in the program with us, and it was a song about him going to this big record company, and they had the album, and they had worked really, really hard on it, and they basically told him that he wasn't good enough to make it. Instead of giving up, however, he did what he did, and he became Chance, and he promoted his own stuff. He began to push it. So I had the same thing happen to me years ago. I was invited to speak on a program with H. Rap Brown, Stokely Carmichael, Imamu Barak, and some other folks in New York. And the person that was controlling my ability to be there told me that I didn't speak well enough to go out and to represent the group and to do that. Now, I could have been shattered by that, but instead I said, no one's ever going to be able to say that to me again. And so I've spoken all over the world, because I didn't think that his comments should make me feel bad about myself, but should encourage me to feel that I needed to just do better. And that's my message to young people. Two basic messages. When you look out of the window, what do you see? You can see the trees that are growing, or you can see the glass that is broken on the ground. Your option is to decide, what do you see, and then what are you going to do with your life to make a difference in how you perceive what the world should be. And then the final comment is that they should approach the work that they create like it's going to go in a time capsule, and it's going to be open for the young people and their great grandchildren in 200 or 300 years. And if you think about that, do you still play that part? Do you write that song? Do you perform that thing that's going to be around, it's going to last much longer than you will? If you take that in consideration, your choices might be better. But at the end of the day, the purpose of an artist is to give a person a reflection of the world that they're in, or the world as it should be. And in doing that, it gives them the opportunity to make a difference in the lives of so many more people. Because you can reach folks through the magic of creativity in ways that other people cannot.
Okay, so you have worked with folks like Angela Bassett and Danny Glover and Robert Townsend and so forth. And I could implore you to tell those stories now, but I think it's probably more important for folks to get the book so they can read from your pages. So if you could just give folks an idea, the book and how they can get it.
Yes, the name of the book again is When Blackness Was Golden, Observations from the Front Line. And the reason that it's called Observations from the Front Line as a subtitle is because I was technically at the front line of the development of the Black arts movement, Black film movement, Black student movement, and so forth. And so it's from a first person perspective, from a person that was actually there. And the book is available at Amazon, Barnes & Noble, BookBaby, Bakers and Taylor, Powell's, Target. You can almost get it anywhere. If you Google it, just run the name When Blackness Was Golden, and you can get the book. And it's a historical retrospective of Chicago and what we think it was the Black arts renaissance that happened between the 60s and the 1980s.
When you use the terminology frontline, there's kind of an implication that we might be at war. and the war.
No, this is what I implied. When you look at the King at the march on the Pettus Bridge, or any march that Martin Luther King did, there's a front line of people. We have the tendency to think that it only takes one person, but that one person does everything. Martin Luther King was a pivotal part of the movement. But when you look at that front line, those were the people that made the real difference. Those were the folks that went back to the communities. Those are the folks that organized the churches. Those were the people that went to jail and stayed there after King was bailed out, and they had to stay in those communities and fight. So observations from the front line basically means I was standing there with these people. And this is my perspective of why and what we did. When I wrote the book, I first started writing about what we did. Then I went back and I started writing about why we did it. And then thirdly, I began to talk about what we felt about what we were doing. We changed a lot in terms of the Black student movement, for example, in the 1960s. We went from no Black teachers and no Black businesses in schools to Black principals, Black institutions, and so forth. So there were some wins. But the win that we need more than anything is our ability to tell our story, and especially in the media, because we don't know the good things we're doing because we are fed with the negative things we're doing constantly. So shows like yours are excessively important for our people to realize we got some folks that are really doing some good stuff.
Yes. So where I was taking it, and I'm glad that you provided clarity because you wrote the book and it's your title. I think about the front line in metaphorical terms in relationship to the war of the minds that's taking place, because the battleground is really in our minds. And there are so many forces that are working against us to lower our vibrational aspects. And we have to fight against those things that bring us into a place of victimhood and depression and anxiety and stress and all that, to liberate ourselves to higher places in consciousness where we can be creative and we can tell that story that needs to be told. So I want to congratulate you for writing this book. And I'm looking forward to reading it. You know, I don't think I'm going to wait for that 4 or 5 hour plane flight. you know,
it's great.
Yeah,
I appreciate that. And you know, at some point we have to stop using words that are damaging to us as a group and individualize our comments. For example, I was at a young lady's house and she was talking about how Black people don't support Black art. And I looked around her house and she had Black art everywhere. And so I said, so the only way you can really say that is if you discount the fact that you're Black. If you're Black and you do, then we do. So we have to truly stop generalizing, because, you know, there are more of us that are still doing good than there are those of us that are doing bad. Because if it was the reverse, then there would be mayhem everywhere, and it's not. But the bad gets the majority of the coverage. And so what I challenge people to do constantly is to say, you know, some of us don't support ourselves, but then some of us do. So we can just slide that some into what we think about ourselves, and then stop looking at ourselves outside of ourselves. Meaning that if you say what Black people are doing or not doing, you have to either include yourself in that group or not say it. You know, one or the other.
Yes. Well, I want to encourage you to keep doing what you're doing. You know, I did some homework before I did your show. and I saw some comments that you made about this notion of retirement.
Yeah.
And basically what you were saying is that if you're doing what you love, why would you ever retire?
Right.
I walked away from a job 8 years ago. I stopped saying I retired. I just left that industry. It was insurance. I left that industry and I decided now it's time to do me. And I'm busier than I ever was. And I can imagine that you're probably in the same place. So
I am.
Yeah.
And you know, the other thing that I do, and I hope that your listeners will take this to heart, I eliminate stress. And so I don't take projects on that are going to be stressful. And if I see that they are, then I try to back out. There were, in LA, there were 5 Black women that were running nonprofit organizations that either had strokes or heart attacks. And a lot of that is because of the stress that they put on themselves and the demands. And a lot of us work at these jobs and we make all of this money and we work, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, and we are strong in what we do. But then we get to a point where by the time we retire, we have nothing left. And we end up, dying or being too ill to even appreciate the gains that we've made. And so part of what I think anybody that's working any kind of field should do is find time for yourself and demand it. And you have to have time to recover. You have to have time to decrud. You have to have time to reinvigorate yourself so that we can continue to fight these battles. And it's battles on all ends, So are we at war? Yes. We're at war for the minds. We're at war for the spirit. We're at war for the resources on the planet, and we shouldn't be, because there's enough, I think, to spread around to everybody. It's tragic when you have billionaires that have more money than the total number of people on the planet. You have people that can feed everybody, so that there would be no world hunger, and we don't appreciate it or deal with it.
Yeah.
So I just want to say, Vince, keep doing what you do. And keep the door open and alive.
Okay. Well, if you do it, I'll continue, my brother. I want to thank you so much for joining me, and thank you so much for your time. We've been together for over an hour, and I know, some folks don't really have a long attention span. I mean, we're getting our information in 10-second bites now. Right. So for someone to hang around for a whole hour and listen to a conversation is really phenomenal. But I think there's something there. I think there's a lot to learn when you can spend time with folks who are as wise as you, who've had the benefit of all this experience, and the fact that you shared your story with so many people and have been able to influence people in so many different ways as a result of the numerous projects that you've been involved in. You're certainly an inspiration to me, and I'm so glad that I was able to find out about you. I'm going to thank my brother Steve. I'm going to thank him as much as I can. Steve, I'm going to say this about Steve, and I know he's going to see this program at some time, but Steve knows everybody. I call Steve the king of name drops. Okay. Mm. But then I came across you.
He's a great guy.
Yes, he is.
He and Jackie both. And to see the commitment that they've made over the years, and their constant giving back is just a wonderful thing to see.
Yes, so, yeah.
I'm glad he introduced us as well, yeah. And thank you for having me.
All right. Well, thank you for joining me, and to those who have been watching live on YouTube and Facebook, thank you for joining us. Know yourself, love yourself, be yourself, make today your best day. Peace.